There is a ship sitting at the bottom of the Aegean Sea that should not exist anymore. Not because it is ancient, not because it was fragile, because by every rule we use to understand how the ocean destroys things, it should already be gone. Ships that sink into the abyss resting under 4-5 kilometers of crushing pressure, in water near freezing, in darkness, so complete that no light has touched them in a century, those ships survive. They hold their shape. Their hulls remain recognizable. The RMS Titanic, 3,800 meters down, is still structurally identifiable after more than 110 years. The German battleship Bismarck, resting under nearly 5 kilometers of Atlantic water at pressures exceeding 500 atmospheres, still has sections that look like a warship. But HMHS Britannic, Titanic's younger sister, built stronger, designed with lessons from the disaster that killed her sibling, rests at just 120 meters off the Greek island of Kea, in water warm enough and shallow enough for recreational divers to visit. And it is vanishing. Structures documented 10 years ago are gone. Hull sections have fractured and collapsed. The rate of degradation has alarmed every researcher who has studied it. And the reason, once you fully understand it, does not just explain one shipwreck. It reveals how the entire ocean operates as a planetary system. Because Britannic is not simply corroding, it is being processed. And what is processing it is not a local condition. It is the energy architecture of Earth's oceans. To understand what is happening to Britannic, you have to stop thinking about the ocean in terms of depth and start thinking about it in terms of energy. The ocean is not a uniform body of water. It is a layered energy system, a planetary structure in which the sun, the atmosphere, and the rotation of the Earth all participate in determining how much chemical and biological activity occurs at any given depth. Near the surface, the ocean is energetically saturated. Solar radiation heats the upper layer. Wind drives currents that mix oxygen into the water column. Photosynthetic life produces organic matter that fuels ecosystems. This energy-rich zone extends with diminishing intensity to roughly 200 meters. Below that, a critical boundary forms, the thermocline. Below the thermocline, temperature drops sharply, currents slow, and the energy budget of the ocean contracts dramatically. This is not a gradual transition, it is a threshold, and the ships that rest below it are, in a very real sense, outside the reach of the planetary system that drives destruction. Britannic, at 120 meters, sits just inside it. That positioning is not incidental, it is everything. The first and most relentless mechanism is oxygen, not its mere presence, but its delivery rate, which is determined by the global oxygen cycle itself. The ocean's dissolved oxygen budget is maintained by two planetary processes: photosynthesis in the upper layer, which produces oxygen as a byproduct of converting sunlight into organic carbon, and atmospheric exchange at the surface, where wind and wave action allow oxygen molecules to transfer directly from air to water. Both processes are strongest near the surface and decay with depth. At 120 meters, Britannic sits within the reach of both. Vertical mixing events, driven by seasonal cooling, storm systems, and wind, push oxygenated surface water downward into Britannic's depth. Lateral currents sweep across the wreck continuously, refreshing the dissolved oxygen concentration at the hull surface. For the ship's iron, this creates a condition with no analog in the deep ocean. A corrosion reaction that is never starved of its primary reactant. Iron sheds electrons, oxygen accepts them, water completes the circuit, and rust forms. In the deep ocean, that reaction slows to a crawl because oxygen moves by diffusion alone through near-still water. Around Britannic, it is actively delivered by a planetary-scale circulation system. The difference is not chemistry, it is supply chain. But this still does not explain the full rate of destruction, because oxygen availability alone would predict corrosion, not the kind of accelerated, compounding degradation that researchers are actually observing. To understand that, you need temperature. And to understand temperature at this depth, you need to understand thermocline dynamics at a global scale. The thermocline is not a fixed layer. It is a seasonal structure. In summer, solar heating intensifies the surface layer and pushes the thermocline deeper, exposing Britannic to warmer water up to 20 degrees Celsius. In winter, the thermocline weakens and the water around the wreck cools toward 13 degrees. This seasonal oscillation matters because reaction rates in both chemistry and biology do not scale linearly with temperature. They scale exponentially. Using the Q10 approximation, a standard tool in biochemistry, every 10 degree Celsius increase in temperature roughly doubles the rate of most biological and chemical reactions. This means Britannic's environment, cycling between 13 and 20 degrees, is running corrosion and microbial metabolism somewhere between 4 and 8 times faster than the near-freezing water surrounding Titanic at depth. Not slightly more aggressive, categorically different. The same iron, the same seawater, but in a completely separate tier of chemical reality, defined not by local conditions but by where the thermocline sits on a planetary scale. And something else is happening inside that warm, oxygenated water, something that transforms the nature of the destruction entirely. Britannic is not corroding, it is being metabolized. In shallow, energetically active water, microbial life achieves a density and diversity that has no parallel in the deep ocean. Within weeks of a metal surface entering these conditions, bacteria establish biofilms, not a thin coating, but a structured community of microorganisms layered across every exposed surface, operating as a coupled biological and electrochemical system. Inside these biofilms, oxygen is consumed at the outer layer, creating anoxic conditions millimeters deeper. In that oxygen-depleted zone, sulfate-reducing bacteria, organisms that evolved to breathe sulfate instead of oxygen, produce hydrogen sulfide as metabolic waste. Hydrogen sulfide penetrates the iron lattice and forms iron sulfide compounds that are structurally brittle. Meanwhile, other bacterial species facilitate direct electron transfer between the metal and surrounding water, turning the hull into a biological electrode. This is not a metaphor. This is the mechanism. The ship's iron is functioning as an energy source for a living ecosystem. And that ecosystem is global in its architecture. The same microbial communities operate in every shallow, warm, oxygenated marine environment on the planet. Britannic is one node in a system that spans every continental shelf on Earth. But this still doesn't explain why deep ocean wrecks, which also have oxygen and also have microbes, manage to retain their structure for centuries. The answer is motion. And the presence or absence of motion at a given depth is not a local phenomenon, it is determined by planetary-scale ocean dynamics. At 120 meters, Britannic is within the reach of surface-driven forces. Major storm systems generate internal waves oscillations that propagate through the water column and create bottom currents capable of moving sediment across the seafloor. Seasonal shifts in surface wind patterns change the direction and intensity of flow across the wreck throughout the year. These currents do something that is counterintuitive but chemically precise. They remove the rust layers that would otherwise act as a partial barrier to further corrosion. In stable, deep water, iron oxide accumulates on metal surfaces and slows the rate at which fresh oxygen can reach unoxidized iron beneath. This self-limiting behavior is what allows deep wrecks to partially stabilize. Around Britannic, that stabilization is prevented. Currents strip the protective layer continuously. He cycle resets. Fresh metal is exposed. The reaction restarts. The ship is locked in a loop of perpetual exposure, driven not by local turbulence, but by the surface energy of an ocean that extends to every corner of the planet. Consider what light does at this depth, not as illumination, but as a driver of temporal instability. In the clear waters of the Aegean, faint photons reach 120 meters under favorable conditions. This is enough to sustain limited photosynthetic activity in algae and cyanobacteria that colonize the upper surfaces of the wreck. But the more significant effect is cyclical. Oxygen production peaks during daylight and drops at night. Microbial communities shift their metabolic state in response. Chemical gradients around the hull oscillate over 24-hour cycles, then shift differently across seasons as the thermocline rises and falls and surface productivity changes with solar angle. What this creates is a system in a state of perpetual, low-amplitude fluctuation, and in chemistry, fluctuation matters more than intensity. A system held at a steady, moderately aggressive condition will reach a partial equilibrium. A system that oscillates, where conditions shift repeatedly before equilibrium is reached, is denied that stability permanently. Every surface on Britannic is in this state. Never fully stabilized, never fully transformed, always in the middle of a reaction. This variability is not a local quirk of the Aegean. It is a consequence of Earth's axial tilt, its orbital mechanics, and the way those forces move through the global ocean system before arriving at 120 meters. And this is where the system breaks, not on the outside of the ship, but inside it, because Britannic is not a flat surface. It is an architecture of enclosed spaces, cargo holds, engine rooms, corridors, crew quarters, and each of those spaces develops a chemistry that is entirely separate from what is happening at the hull's exterior. The exterior is an open system. Water flows, oxygen is refreshed, and the processes already described run at full speed. The interior is a semi-closed system. Water enters through ruptures and gaps, but slowly. Oxygen brought in is consumed by corrosion and microbial activity faster than it is replaced. Over time, compartments become hypoxic. Some become fully anoxic. In these zones, sulfate-reducing bacteria dominate, producing hydrogen sulfide that diffuses into the structural metal and forms iron sulfide compounds throughout the inner framework. These compounds are not simply weaker than steel. They are brittle in a mechanically specific way. They do not deform under stress. They fracture. Because they form inside the metal rather than on its surface, the damage is invisible until a structural member reaches its failure threshold and gives way suddenly. One ship, two completely separate chemistries, two different timelines of destruction. And where they meet at every boundary between oxygenated exterior and anoxic interior is where the most violent processes of all occur. At the boundary between oxygenated exterior water and the oxygen-depleted interior, a third chemistry emerges, and it is more destructive than either of the other two individually. Where high oxygen water meets low oxygen, sulfide-rich water across a metal interface, an electrochemical gradient forms. One side of the metal becomes an anode. It loses material, dissolving iron ions into solution. The other side becomes a cathode. It receives electrons and deposits compounds. This galvanic cell operates continuously, driven by the chemical difference between two environments that the ship's own structure separates. The result is pitting, not the uniform thinning of a surface corroding evenly, but the formation of narrow, deep cavities bored into specific points where the electrochemical gradient is steepest. Pitting is the most dangerous form of corrosion in structural engineering precisely because it concentrates stress. A pit does not need to be wide to be critical. At sufficient depth, relative to surrounding material thickness, it creates a stress concentration that initiates cracking, and cracks propagate. This is how Britannic loses not gradual layers of surface material, but entire structural connections at once. A beam that appeared intact on one dive is missing on the next. Not because it corroded slowly to nothing, because chemistry prepared it invisibly, and the ocean finished the job in a single event. Now place Britannic beside the ships that survive. RMS Titanic, 3,800 meters deep, water temperature near 2 degrees Celsius, oxygen present but moving through near still water by diffusion alone, no surface-driven currents, no thermocline oscillation, no photosynthetic variability, microbial communities sparse and slow metabolizing. After 110 years, Titanic retains its grand staircase, its hull plating, its recognizable silhouette even as microbes known as rusticles slowly consume it. The German battleship Bismarck, nearly 5,000 meters down, under pressure exceeding 500 atmospheres. In water so cold and stable that chemical reaction rates are a fraction of what they are in the upper ocean, Bismarck still looks like a warship. Now understand what this comparison reveals. Pressure does not preserve. Pressure is nearly irrelevant. What preserves is the absence of energy, low temperature that slows every reaction, limited oxygen throughput that starves corrosion, stability that allows protective layers to form and hold, darkness that eliminates photosynthetic variability, and stillness that prevents currents from stripping away whatever chemistry tries to build. Britannic has none of those protections. It sits in the most energetically active tier of a planetary ocean system, and it is being consumed accordingly. The ocean did not destroy it. The ocean is processing it the way it processes everything that falls into its energetic zone. Once you see the system, the paradox is gone, and something more important takes its place. The ocean does not preserve history, it metabolizes it. What looks like decay is actually conversion. Iron becoming rust, becoming sediment, becoming chemistry, becoming biology, becoming part of the water column and the seafloor, and the organisms that live there. Britannic is not disappearing, it is being redistributed, and Britannic is not alone. Of the estimated 3 million unexamined shipwrecks on the global seafloor, the vast majority rest in coastal waters and continental shelves, the same energetically active zone where every mechanism described in this story is operating right now at full speed, without pause. Every year, without documentation, is a year in which detail dissolves irreversibly. Every structure that collapses carries material evidence of a human moment, a design decision, a manufacturing choice, the physical record of a specific point in history, and transforms it into ocean chemistry that carries no memory of what it was. The ships are not frozen in time. They are part of time, part of the system, being processed by a planetary machine that has been running since long before any of them sank, and will keep running long after the last trace of them is gone. You now see the ocean differently, not as a graveyard, not as a museum beneath the surface, but as a system, energetic, layered, relentless, that consumes everything placed within it, according to rules written by physics and biology, and the position of Earth relative to the Sun. What looks like silence on the seafloor is chemistry in progress. What looks like ruins is a reaction still running. What looks like the past is, in every measurable sense, still happening. Subscribe to Sunken Realms Deep, where lost ships are not just remembered, but understood as part of the ocean itself.